I I'm gonna talk about torches for a couple minutes. Um, First, when on the regulator, um, the acetylene maxes out at 15 psi, and you never put it anywhere near that close. Halfway in the range that it runs, I run both my regulators at quarter of the way up on the range. I don't even look at the numbers. Just quarter on the low, quarter to a third. Never halfway, and you keep it at quarter of the way up, which is on the acetylene it would be about 7, maybe 8, or at the most, and the oxygen 30 to 50, I believe, but quarter of the way up, and that's from a double zero tip to a number 3. You still leave the regulator at quarter of the way up, both of them. And I got some notes written down here just so I don't repeat myself over and over and over. Now, on the tips, um, I have a number 0 and a double zero. Works real well with the half size welding rods on 20 gauge sheet metal. You can do a really nice job. But the number 0 tip doesn't work too well on 18 gauge and antique car metal because it's a little thicker, and it takes a little longer to heat up. And quite often when you're welding, you get a gap because one metal will pull away from the other. And then as soon as you have a gap, then the small rod doesn't work well. You need the big rod, and then you have too much metal, too much gap, and you can't keep your heat in the small area. You got to heat up a bigger area because you got a gap there. Plus you got a big rod, so you need a number 1 tip. Number 2 tips are for, say, muffler pipe. And okay, uh, excuse me for looking distracted, but I'm trying not to repeat myself. Okay, now on the tips, when you light one up, when you light it up, um, try to turn it up a fairly good amount. That way it doesn't fill the room full of black soot. And then you turn it down so that the smoke just disappears, and then you turn your oxygen on and adjust the tip so that there's 1 tip, because it'll come in. It'll be 2 tips and it'll come smaller and smaller. And just at that point where you have 1 tip, then you usually have to turn your acetylene back out a little bit to make it a little bit hotter, then readjust your oxygen to match it. And the adjustment on the tip on your flame in your tip is according to how much heat you want, because there is a little bit of adjustment on every tip. The tips are almost overlapped. Like if you run a number 1 as hot as you can get it, that's a number 2 as cold as you can get it. But when you run a tip that on the cold side, it's liable to go pop and blow all your weld out and make sparks and keep going out. So you want your tips adjusted pretty close to where they're designed to run, or a smidgen hot. But if you have, while you're welding, if your adjustment goes out and you happen to see the 2 flame thing coming out, I believe that's oxidizing. I could be wrong, but anyway, that when you heat up, you'll find it's not heating up as good. So you have to always keep your tip turned back. Now, if you have the um, not enough oxygen, then you have an uneven burn, and it'll make the weld kind of crystallize and bubbly and foamy, and it makes a brittle, horrible weld. You don't want to weld in those conditions. And the same thing happens if you're welding something and you've got a massive amount of rust. it'll be right foamy and bubbly and kind of crispy like and hoy and and the the heat will find the metal for the rod to stick to in the rust if there's any metal there, because it won't actually stick to rust. It'll find metal in there. But anyway, to get off that, um, oh my, I'm caught up. Maybe I said everything. Adjustment. Well, anyway, the biggest thing when you're the type of welds, like in a perfect world, you make a nice even puddle in your two pieces of weld, a nice perfectly round kind of like red puddle, and you keep your rod right in it, and you just move your torch along and you make a perfect weld. But it takes way too long, and in sheet metal where the stuff is thinner, the puddle is, especially on a car where you don't want to be there too long, you don't actually make a puddle, because the puddle will all of a sudden be a hole, and a big hole, like over a quarter of an inch, and you had to fill it in, and it's wasted heat and time. And also, it's all right to make a puddle and follow it if you can do it, but I don't. I heat my rod, and I keep the tip on the rod to distract it, as a buffer to keep it off the metal, and I keep the tip right on the rod, and the two pieces of metal underneath me, where um, the flame bounces off the rod, it'll hit the metal, and that's heats up the metal enough to accept the rod. And that's kind of how I make my drips. And also, when you make a puddle, or not a puddle but a blob that goes down to the metal, make sure right at that time you move your tip over and melt it into the metal, because on steel weld, if you have a bump, it's not penetrated. It has to blend in on the side of all the bumps, have to be kind of melted into the metal. It's not like a MIG welder. A MIG welder will penetrate and leave a big bump on top that looks just like a circle. Well, if you do that with a steel weld, it's got no penetration at all. And if it's a gas tank, it's going to leak everywhere. You have to, as you weld and you're heating up your rod and the metal underneath it on the reflection, you, as it blobs in, as soon as you see the little bump, you melt it into wherever it's a convenient spot to carry on. And if your rod sticks, roll it sideways. Like, don't try to pull it, don't bend it back and forth, just rock it, like keep the heat there as fast as you can, but you turn the rod so that it drops into the hole of the weld, and then reheat it, and it'll continue your weld. It'll just blob in, melt it in, and then you rock it the other way, because sometimes a person's not steady. And when you're not steady, the rod's going to stick about 50 times on in 4 inches. It's going to stick constantly back and forth, and you just roll the rod like in your fingers. Just sometimes you have to come right onto it, but you bend it at the weld to drop in the hole, heat it in, blend it, and then rock it that way, heat it in, blend it, and rock it this way, and kind of go from there. If you're welding something like a cone, then you can weld and just make a nice bead and just follow right along. But sheet metal on cars, one piece is always sinking in and one sinking out. Like one bulges out, one bulges in. So you have to really be on top of the um, you have to catch it before it moves too far. And if you can, and you tack it kind of and pull your heat away, the blowgun pulls the metal right back towards you. Like if it sunk in when you heat up a spot and you blow it, it'll pull right back. Unfortunately, with torches, when you're using the blowgun, you're spending as much time with the torch sitting in the air as you are welding, and it's kind of an expensive, horrible way of doing it. But the blowgun does work good. Water is slower, inconvenient, and doesn't stay on the rag at the weld. You got to constantly flip the rag around, and you end up burning your hand on the rag because the rag will evaporate all the water and be almost on fire, and you flip it around and it's constantly drying, and you it's hard to get water. Doesn't work too good unless you heat something up and drop it in a pan. But anyway, I've probably missed some points, but anyway, I just thought I'd speak of what comes to my mind. But anyway, have a good night and bye.